Kia ora, everybody, and welcome to the Word Festival. There was a brief shot before of the sponsors, and I will acknowledge the sponsors, but before that there is someone else we need to acknowledge, and I would like to acknowledge that the festival takes place on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I myself am from the Taranaki Māori nation of Aotearoa, but I am living in what is colonially known as North Vancouver, and that is Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh territory. We are very lucky to have the festival online today, and we are encouraging everyone to become members. If you want to, you can contribute through our silent auction, which is at wordvancouver.com. And we'd also like to acknowledge the many sponsors who have been very generous in making this festival happen. And the major sponsor is Pace and Associated Accounting. The other generous donors and sponsors are the Canada Council for the Arts, the Canada Heritage Fund, BC Gaming, Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, DBVIA, the Hamba Foundation, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, CWILL, Pace and Associates again, the Federation of BC Writers, the League of Canadian Poets, the Writers Union of Canada. And without them, this festival would not happen. So please, wherever you are, give yourselves and the sponsors a round of applause for being here on a Sunday afternoon in Vancouver. But we are very lucky to welcome someone from across the Pacific. Kōtuku Titihuia Nuttall is joining us from Aotearoa, New Zealand. They are the holder of the an MA from the International Institute of Modern Letters, won the 2020 Adam Foundation Prize, and is a current PhD candidate at the IIML, which is the International Institute of Modern Letters, which we'll talk about in a little while. And she's based in Te Whanganui Atara, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kōtuku, can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can. Kia ora, David.
Kia ora. Feel free to introduce yourself in your own way. Do you have other things that I should have mentioned?
I don't think so. Those are the basic things that get mentioned. I'm also from Taranaki. Yes, I don't know if you and Tina have ever talked about that, but yeah, my mother is also from Taranaki, and my biological father is from the Saanich Peninsula. He's with Saanich. But yeah, we're Ngāti Te Whiti, I think.
Oh, named after the prophet Te Whiti.
Yes, yeah.
Wow.
So whereabouts are you?
We are the Taranaki iwi, so we are just...
Oh, you're the big... Yeah, you get the big Taranaki name, right, yeah.
Well, I would say more that they kind of stole our name to name the province, but... but yes, Te Whiti is... his mother is from our marae too, so, and Puniho, and so I just was back there. But one of the interesting things about you and I is we do have lots of interesting connections, and you have managed to connect those two worlds, the Aotearoa world and the Coast Salish world. So I'm going to ask, like, how did you come up with this great speculative fantastic idea, or is it that speculative or fantastic?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it definitely is speculative, but you would actually be quite familiar with kind of the like genesis of the idea for me was spending a lot of time in the swamps in Kapiti, and with the island, there's an island there that is quite close and quite imposing on the landscape, and it's kind of its own presence on the coast, I would say. And so I was kind of just thinking about what if the sounds, the Salish Sea was kind of as close as Kapiti was, if I could see kind of all those different islands that I also come from, that close to where I was living now. And it was also the first lockdown as well, so lots of introspective and like isolated thinking.
Yeah, it's about, I don't know, is it 2 miles offshore Kapiti?
I'm not sure, but people regularly swim to it, and it's only a 15-minute boat ride, I think.
Yeah, and it's a bird sanctuary now, but it was originally the stronghold of Te Rauparaha. So that also has the Te Rauparaha is a very famous Māori chief of the Ngāti Toa who was feared and revered by many.
Yeah.
So perhaps we should talk about the title of your book. How did you come up with the title? And I know it has different translations, so I'd love you to explain how you imagine that title.
Definitely having the multiple meanings was important to me, like right from the start. I am like a big bird person, and nature person in general, which probably you notice in the book. But also I kind of was thinking a lot about like the idea of being new to something, or like returning to something or being unfamiliar with something. And so kind of Tauhou can be translated as like stranger, but it can also be translated as like novice, or like visitor or something. So I was kind of thinking about the idea of returning to things, and I guess being ready to learn and stuff like that. And then as well, the Tauhou is the wax-eye bird, which is a little, like, almost like a finch. I'm not sure what family it belongs to, but it's actually self-introduced to New Zealand.
Oh.
It kind of appeared just after Pākehā arrived. So I think maybe a bit later, 1800s, I think, it showed up. And there's no record of anyone bringing it on purpose or anything. It just kind of arrived and then is here now, and we consider it a native bird. But yeah, so it's Tauhou, so like a stranger, like it's just appeared.
Yeah, I'm reading the reviews. A lot of people talk about it as being the stranger, but I know that sometimes not everything translates exactly right, which is, I think, one of the interesting things about your book. About you actually put in a glossary to introduce us to new words. So for most of us, we're strangers to at least one or two or three of the languages and the things. So how did you go about compiling the glossary and deciding how much or how little of the languages?
So the New Zealand version actually doesn't have a Māori glossary.
Okay.
Which was important to me, but there's lots of different opinions about that here and in other places. I know it's a really big conversation about translating Indigenous words and language and stuff like that. For me, I'm a very, very elementary, maybe less than elementary, Te Reo Māori speaker. So all the words, most of the words that have been included are like, to me, the ones I would use. They're very, well, lots of them are like place names, family names, plants, animals kind of thing. And I didn't want to include too much Māori that I couldn't write myself. And that's just because I don't know what I would be writing. And because Māori has its own poetry and music and stuff like that, that as a person who doesn't speak fluently, like I don't have. But yeah, I didn't include a glossary for New Zealand because I thought lots of these words would be familiar to people, even people who think they don't speak Māori. These are words that like could pop up in kind of everyday stuff and you just wouldn't notice or you take it for granted. And also there are things that are really easy to like access, whether that's online or if you know someone who speaks Māori. But then for the Canadian edition, I figured it would be kind of more prudent to include because there's so, for most people, I imagine this would be the first time they're coming across Māori. And also, I think because Indigenous language revitalisation has so much, like, there's so many more languages in British Columbia alone that it kind of felt more appropriate. Whereas here, even though we have dialects of Māori, once you know certain words, you can recognise them even in their dialectical form.
Yeah, I often say that's one of the big differences really is that even if you don't like Māori people in New Zealand, you probably know 50 Māori words.
Exactly.
Just because they're everywhere. But it is a thing once you start getting translated and put it overseas, like how you did it. Seeing that we're talking about the back of the book, we're starting at the back. The author's note is really interesting too, that you have qualified that you don't want it to be seen as kind of the truth. Do you want to like to elaborate on that?
I think one of the biggest things that kind of drove me to write that note was sometimes when people from certain communities write things, even if it's like explicitly fiction, that can be taken as a guide or something that is completely true about that entire group of people or associated groups of people. And I know it's another contentious issue here between Māori is how you depict things and then who takes what from that. And so I guess I just wanted to be clear that this is, it's fiction and it doesn't represent anything other than the book that I wrote, I guess. And that if themes or ideas in it interest you, that's just the beginning, and there's other people who have written whole histories and other fiction and other poetry and stuff that is probably much more informative and quote unquote correct.
Well, I mean, you do say the truth is colonization and genocide happened and they continue to happen, and a lot of your characters are responding in some way in both those worlds to that. It's interesting because you say fiction. One of the most exciting things about your book is that it is actually poetry and fiction, and people have also called parts of it fable. And I'm really interested in the process by which you created the overall book. Like, when did you go, oh, it's a novel? Or did you start with pieces? Or anyway, that was my question.
So the writing workshop that it comes from, that master's course which you mentioned before, I was actually kind of in the short story novel class. So I was only working with people who were writing short stories and longer. And I had briefly considered applying for the nonfiction class, but I didn't really have a background in nonfiction and I didn't have practice in writing that kind of form. And my mother gave me lots of good advice, as she is prone to doing. And so I ended up in fiction, which I think was for the best. But I started out you start with writing exercises, which can be a bit blur if you don't put yourself into them a lot. And at the start I was a bit suspicious. But then a few weeks in, I kind of found a voice that I liked working with, and kind of like a not just aesthetic, but kind of like an energy in the pieces I was bringing to class. And I kind of kept rolling with that. And lots of those smaller pieces in the book actually came from those earlier weeks in the course. Kind of those ones that are like half a page were just like little things that I was working on that were just capturing smaller moments. And then it kind of wasn't until later that I actually started writing the big proper short stories. And the first one I actually wrote was the one with the two islands, and the people on both islands kind of meeting and making contact. That was the first one that I thought of, like when I was walking around the swamps a lot and looking at Kapiti Island. But it actually ended up near the end of the book. Yeah, so they kind of, it was always pieces, but very early on, it was like clear. They would be very close together, and that there was kind of a lot of stuff to be stitched together as well.
Yeah, the IIML, International Institute of Modern Letters, is pretty influential in terms of New Zealand literature, but I mean, it's often a fairly intense year, and there's lots of feedback, and it's often dictated by the people who are also in your year. So
Totally.
I was wondering, did you have a lot of collaboration and a lot of feedback in that year?
It was a tricky year. It was the first year of the pandemic. And I was also in a class where I was the only Māori person, the only Māori or Pacifica person in the class. And then I had one other person of colour in my class as well. So it was quite, even though it's only 10 people, it's a very like settler dominated space, which is, I mean, often true in kind of university environments, depending on what classes you're in. So even though it was very lovely and I loved actually everyone in that class, it was it's tricky to get the kind of feedback you want and need when people are often like afraid to touch certain things, or maybe they don't get everything, and often it can be tricky to get past kind of some of the surface level aspects of the work you're presenting. But I had a really great course convener, and I also had a lot of support from my family, and I kind of just hunkered down at home for most of the year and just kind of got very deep.
Or was it all done online because of COVID?
Yeah, so we had a couple weeks of class, and then it was COVID.
Oh,
and
okay.
it was lockdown. And then we came back for a bit, and then I think there was another lockdown. Yeah, and then so I can't remember the kind of split in the end, but it was a lot of and that doesn't help the workshop process either, I think, because like not being in the same room, because it's very, especially if you have difficulties with like reading faces or expressions or tone or anything like that, having to do it on a screen is really difficult. And then you kind of don't know where you stand, and that's tricky when you're getting feedback and you don't know the people properly, and because it's all about like trust and like, you know, being sure that the people who are giving you the feedback kind of want the best for your work and stuff like that.
Yeah, I can imagine that idea of strangers and being strangers kind of was kept by the fact that you were having to do that. But you mentioned this idea of supporting Indigenous writers, I actually see in my notes here that your PhD, you are focusing partly on developing a methodology to support Indigenous authors emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually while writing.
Mhm.
How is that going?
It is going. It's going. I'm like I'm a year and a half. I'm halfway through the program. At the moment, I've just been like confirmed. It's definitely a struggle. I think to kind of, so what I'm doing is essentially so I can write what I want to write. The book I wanted to write when I went to write Tauhou was much darker and like troubling, I think. In general, in my mind, I think of Tauhou as quite a light book, considering kind of what I was thinking about when I wrote it. And I was definitely like pulling myself back and trying to kind of transform the material, so to speak. But kind of what I really wanted to be writing about was the violence of colonialism, and especially things like the state care system and residential schools, both of which have affected, you know, branches of my family and my grandparents especially. And so the book I'm trying to write now is kind of about those systems. And I'm trying to be unflinching, but it's difficult to do just even the research. I've been looking at certain records and stuff for years, and I often just have to put it away because it's too much, even though, you know, obviously these aren't things that have happened to me, but it's just so intense, and it's very like hurtful even just to reread those things. So the idea of the PhD is to, I guess, collate things that have helped me stay the course and also not fall into disrepair, essentially. And so I'm kind of pulling stuff from other writers working with similar work and other theorists, and also some cultural frameworks and stuff as well.
Well, when you come to Vancouver, I should introduce you to Alice Te Punga Somerville, who does some of that work.
Yes. Yes, yeah. I meant to, because it's another funny, you know, New Zealand's so small, but she was my mum's PhD supervisor. And I've also met her a few times now, but yeah, she's one of the people that I'm meaning to see when I come visit.
Yeah, just to go back to this idea of like a lot of Indigenous writers and artists are wanting to deal with traumatic things, and one of the forms that has emerged is horror.
Yeah.
And with like filmmakers like Jeff Barnaby here making horror like Blood Quantum and like that. So I see in my notes that you have called your novel a native horror. So is that a genre that you're going to explore? Like
Yeah, I was kind of definitely thinking of it along those lines of the things I want to write about are horrific, but I feel like, especially when you know you're going to have a settler readership, I guess I was thinking about how I want to present that in a way that is very straightforward, but also self-aware, I guess. And so the premise of the novel is essentially that there's a human experiment that happens on Native people, and then it ends, and then everyone has to live together still, the people who are running the experiment and the people who are in the experiment. And everything that happens in the experiment is essentially things that all happened in residential school or the state care system, but presented as science fiction, even though it's true.
Yeah, it's hard to read the things where they tested like nutrients, where they would just go, well, let's not give these students this food, and then we'll give these ones this food and see what happens. As though people were guinea pigs and sterilization, and there's a lot of difficult history to emerging, and I think sometimes people do look to artists to lead the way to create things that will I don't know how to say it, but have you seen Reservation Dogs?
Yes, yeah.
So I think that is one of the game changers, and it deals with some very serious things that happen, but the resilience and the humor of those young people is very powerful in terms of showing the survival, I guess. But I also really love the spirit walker, the spirit guy.
Yeah.
Because he represents that kind of trickster spirit that I think was always present in Indigenous work. But
yeah, it's so funny. In Aotearoa and Turtle Island, the trickster is such a big character, a big presence. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we have Taika Waititi, who's kind of an actual living trickster, shapeshifter. But even I think in your book, there is a playfulness whereby we think we're somewhere and then we're like, oh, you're actually here, or we're with some people, and then it changes, and then we're with those people, but they're going to come back. And I really love that sense of play and not having to have one central character who has a chronological journey, which we kind of get used to. But I wondered just how conscious you were of when you went to structure all the pieces of what would go where, and whether you were like you actually talk about being light, like in places. Like, did you consciously go, I want that there and then that there to play with those things?
Yeah. There was a lot of shuffling around titles and pieces of paper in different kind of little boxes and then moving them around. Initially, my supervisor had suggested the idea of using the concept of ahika, which is like the home fires being lit. So like the idea of connection between Māori people and their land, and that kind of moves from being completely connected and the fire being very strong, and then it kind of moves through to being disconnected, and the fire not being as strong and like having not a great connection, and then being completely removed. But even then it's still kind of embers burning, which I did like, but in the end I think wasn't quite right for the book. And then I kind of just went with kind of the 4 big seasons as we think of them, like spring, summer, autumn, winter. But I've used kind of the Saanich ideas of those seasons to structure the book. So those kind of follow what is happening to the earth as the seasons pass. And so in that there's still those ideas of connection, but also it's cyclical rather than like a binary of moving towards something or away from something. And it's more repetitive and more, you always know it's going to come back around. And then within that, I've kind of tried to mix the pieces. So there's some modern and some less modern, but also mix the places while maintaining kind of a strong, to me at least, there was a thread between each section that hopefully kind of added to the reading experience.
Well, I think it is. I mean, it makes you shift. There's a little bit of look, like where are we? Where are we? Where are we? Because we become a little bit like a stranger. We think, oh, I know this. Oh no, I don't know these people. Like there's a lot of characters to hold on to. So I like that. It's constantly making us reevaluate where we are and who we're with, and then even also what time.
Yeah.
One of the central. We'll come back to this idea of threading things together and tattoos in a second. But one of the central sections I felt, and I noticed some other reviewers too, was the taniwha section.
Yeah.
So maybe for the people who don't know what a taniwha is, or I'd also be interested in your concept of what a taniwha is. Perhaps you could explain that, and then also that's elaborate a bit more on that section.
Yeah. So I think the common, especially in English, the common translation is it's like a monster, often like a serpent. But in my understanding anyway, and kind of what I've written there is like a taniwha is kind of like a spirit, often of a place, like a body of water, who can be maybe a bit aggressive towards humans. Also usually guarding the kind of the place that it's from. So even though I guess we think of it as a monster, maybe I think of it more as like a guardian figure. Yeah, so I've played with that a bit in that piece, but
well, you put them in a museum, so that's another. Yeah, so that, like, just in my own understanding, we would associate taniwha with water, and so on a river, people would say, be very careful, there's a taniwha in that whirlpool that will pull you down. So often associated with water, but not necessarily. So that's why it was great to go, oh, wow, you've taken a taniwha or your idea and then have them in this museum. And I just was fascinated by that. There's also, often, I remember once there was some big invitation to the prime ministers and presidents of the world to come to Auckland, and everything was locked down, and they were having a Maori welcome, and they were trying to translate, and the Maori guy who was introducing them said, welcome all you taniwha from around the world.
Yeah.
And the translation came out, welcome all you monsters.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then there was like a pause, like leaders, big leaders.
Because I think it would be a great thing to be called a taniwha of your kind of area you work in. Like, that would be that's a good compliment, I think.
You would like to be called a taniwha?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone would agree that I am, but I think it's I think if you're someone who is very ferocious in what you do, and also kind of working ideally towards, these ideas of like guardianship and kind of taking care of people, I think it's a good idea. It's like a nice sentiment.
Well, also they are usually very elaborately tattooed, or they have a lot of like one of the sections from your book, which I also is in this book, is moko tattoo, and so I really love that section where you have two different people getting tattooed in two different places in two different ways, and also obviously you have some of your own. So I was wondering about whether, just talking about that section, and also what the tattoo moko practice means to you.
I think just because of the generation I am, tattoos are quite big. Like, whenever I get a chunk of money for anything, I get a new tattoo. It's like a really nice, it's a really nice permanent thing for me. I'm also someone who, like, as a teenager especially, changed my appearance a lot. And so I think it's another nice way of kind of having ownership of your body, and also feeling very in your body, because you can't ignore that you're kind of sharing intimacy with the person doing it to you, and also that you're kind of making these changes that you see every day and you feel physically, and then they're there. But I started out getting Pākehā style tattoos, and I still do. So like traditional with a machine gun, and kind of the designs or whatever you want. You can ask for things and stuff like that. And then I really got interested in tattooing. I haven't always been so much of a writer. I used to be more of a visual kind of person. I used to do a lot of like drawing and art and stuff like that. And I think my mum always thought and wanted me to be a tattoo artist. And then I didn't. I did some hand poke tattoos for a while. So most of my tattoos now are like practice ones. And yeah, I don't know, there's something about it that is very special. I think the few people I did tattoo when I was doing tattoos, it's amazing how quickly, as soon as you start kind of sharing that bodily intimacy, it's amazing what people will talk about, or like just things come up. And it's very intense, and definitely like heavy stuff pops up really quickly, but I think that's quite regular for tattoos as well. Like, people often get tattoos to mark kind of resilience from like traumatic events and stuff like that. So that was kind of, it's still like a big interest of mine. I'm just not practicing it at the moment. And then this one here that I have was a like master's graduation gift from my mum. And we went to visit someone, Viani Parata, in Titahi Bay. So she is also a Aotearoa, because she's kind of in that rohi. And we got some, not matching, but kind of hand poke tattoos, but still with the like moko style of, you kind of sit down and you talk about what the tattoo is for you, and then the artist draws it up on you as you talk. You can make requests sometimes, but it's in general, what I've heard about tā moko is you just do the talking and the artist does the drawing, and they're making it for you in that moment. And that was really wonderful.
Great. Yeah, it's again, I would encourage people to read the book that it comes from, but also you did, when you talk about doing, excuse me, you did your own cover, which has also got design elements. Like, can you describe the design that you decided for this one?
Yeah. So the fish are actually, I'm trying to remember, they're candlefish, ulikins. Yeah. So they're kind of in the background, and then over top on the left side there's like a I've actually got a copy here. we've got like an ancestor figure on each side. The left side's the Māori side, so you can see like there's a tanico pattern at the top, and then there's like the kind of like the figure you would see on a po, like a post, and then there's also like some little. There's like a bird. That's a bird in the middle, and then on the right side is the Salish iconography. So another like female ancestor figure. And there's like a Salish eye at the bottom and some weaving patterns up the top, or the other way around. Yeah, so it's just like reflections, but also distorted and of each place.
I just was having a fascinating chat about ulukans because not many people know what an ulukan is, even here. When I talk about, yeah, like it's not a common fish. You can't go into the supermarket and buy it, right? But it's for Hobie, for some First Nations in the north, that's the symbol of spring. They come up, but it's also ulukan grease was created, and then it was in a box. They would carry it around, so there was they can still follow where people went for centuries by the ulukan grease that leaked down out of the box. So there's a thing called the grease trail, the ulukan grease trail, so they can now map where people went as they traded through British Columbia carrying the boxes of ulukan grease.
Amazing.
Yeah, but there's a shout out to the Indigenous restaurant, Salmon and Bannock. You can eat smoked ulukan. I ate there recently, and but they're a very profound fish because if you've gone through winter and you're running out of food, when these fish come back, that is a sign that you're going to survive. Basically, the spring has come. So great that you put ulukans on your book. Let's talk about people who are strong and represent. It might be called tanifas. I'm having trouble with what you're doing, but here is Joshua Wisehead with Johnny Appleseed. So you mentioned that you were a fan.
Yes, very big fan.
And also, he was the editor of this book, which I'm having trouble again with. There we go. Anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer Speculative Fiction, Love After the End. So, what is it about those writers that you are interested in, I guess, and how are you considering maybe you're part of that movement?
I think it was another like lockdown thing, and it was also being stuck in New Zealand thing. I kind of in 2020 was very desperately trying to get back to Canada, which is not a financially easy task, especially because I'm a kind of person who can't work too much. So I often am only like working part-time. And so not so flush with cash. And kind of what I ended up doing, especially while I was studying, was just reading a lot of kind of Turtle Island Indigenous literature, a lot of First Nations literature, especially from younger generations. And Joshua was like one of the first writers I read in that moment, and it just was a lot. Like it was very moving to feel recognized in a place where you can't be recognized as certain things. By which I mean, I guess in New Zealand, it's easy. It's fairly easy for me to be recognized as Māori, but while I was dealing with kind of my First Nations identity and coming to terms with it, I guess, there was no one. I wasn't going to walk down the street and no one would no. Or even lots of my friends or like people I knew didn't understand or recognize that. So to be finding those connections in books was really important. And definitely the queer aspect of all that writing was equally as like almost like cradling, like it was very safe feeling, because I think it's difficult sometimes to connect with your culture, but then aspects of it have kind of been marred by colonialism. And so that's kind of can be a difficult part of finding where you sit with your culture. So all those two-spirit authors and Indigenous queer authors kind of balance both those things, and are just so good also at what they do.
Yeah, there's a real resurgence of two-spirit identity and two-spirit art and literature, but it's tough, I think, because like for the younger generation, like I know in our own university, the chief, even though he'd gone to the residential school and he had experienced trauma at there, he still found it difficult to embrace Indigenous queer people and understand them. And I think that's one of the toughest parts about that ongoing residential school kind of legacy. And as we both know, certain political parties in both Canada and New Zealand like to cash in on this idea of anything that isn't het is kind of dangerous, right? So I just saw the thing about the National Party in New Zealand they were running on, and just was like, oh my God, we're going backwards.
Yeah, they're definitely kind of coasting off of that kind of those Trump politics from America as well, to gain, especially after lockdown. I think there's a rise of that, and it's very troubling to see it so blatantly everywhere now, like in all the media outlets as well. Like it's just suddenly okay to, I guess, with like engage with like post-truth ideas of what you can say and what you can enact in Parliament as well.
I think it's they struggle to find any issue that is going to get those swing voters to go one way or the other. And then they, because it's happened in the United States, this idea of banning certain books and not having gender neutral bathrooms, and that's something, this is something that will polarize people, and we can jump on it. So I mean, that's what I think what's so important about Indigenous queer literature is that it's in a fight to try and make this a positive time when there's still a lot of hate out there, unfortunately. It is 2:49. We have 10 minutes to go. Please, if anyone has any questions out there. Sorry, was that someone on the microphone? Please write them into the comment section. No questions so far. Okay, we will keep going. About, I guess, I'm going to kind of go back to being shapeshifters, because you are living in these very different places and moving around, and we talked about taniwhas. Do you see yourself as being able to shapeshift and move between these with some comfort now?
Yeah, I'm definitely.
I don't know. Keep talking. It's something about the microphone. Sorry.
Okay. I'm definitely more comfortable. I don't know if things change so much. I think not that my identity is static, but more just that it's been added, not added to, like it was always there, but yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. It's just another thing I carry around when I'm in the world. Yeah, I don't think I'm much of a shapeshifter. I think I'm too black and white sometimes, like, to use that word.
No, but that's interesting. I saw one of the things about tattoo and body. You were interested. It said you were interested in body modification. So this idea that if you do walk down a street somewhere, people will go, "Oh, there's something about that person that's not the normal person who's walking down Langton Quay," or like, I want them to ask me about my earrings or my tattoos or what I wear or how I speak. So
yeah. Oh, I like the idea of like building, like that you get to build your own body. Like you're born with a certain body, but you get to add to that if you want to, and like you can change that or enhance it or decorate it how you want. Yeah, that is definitely, I think, the thing that makes me like happiest with myself is when I'm in control of how I look, I guess. Yeah.
Great. So this concept of distance and home, has the book managed to change that for you? Like, do you now feel closer or further, or like, I guess one of the things is like, has the book changed your life?
Yeah, I think being able to publish it in Canada and America, Turtle Island as a whole, is kind of outrageous. Like it's felt very unbelievable. And House of Anansi have been so lovely and supportive the whole time. And they really champion the book as well, which is amazing. When kind of, they just received it from my New Zealand publisher being like, maybe you would like this, I don't know. And that has been, that has changed the way I feel a lot about returning to Canada, to spending any amount of time there as well. And I think the other thing that helped is my little sister is based in Vancouver at the moment. And so it's nice to have that kind of living thread there, when kind of we're very estranged from our biological father. And so kind of this whole time I've been reaching back past him to get at everything else, because he kind of gatekept that for so long. So now there's kind of a mishmash of all these different connections that I have that make the strands feel strong enough to hold on to. And that is very comforting and very, it makes things much easier. Definitely there's still a lot to deal with there, but I'm kind of able to live with things now, whereas before I was definitely very, very homesick and very felt kind of torn up about it, I guess, being here and wanting to be there, but also definitely I think New Zealand is the like end game home for me. Anytime I leave will just be visits or like long visits or whatever, but I know that at the end of the day I probably have to come back here, so it's tricky.
What about the rest of the world though? Do you have desires to travel?
Yeah, a bit. I think it's difficult kind of coming of age in a time where it's like we have to examine like tourism practices and kind of
Climate change on an airplane
and stuff. Yeah, so it's a bit difficult to be like, I'll head over to Bali because it's so cheap and have a great time and not think about my impact in what I'm doing there and stuff like that. So for me, I'm keen to visit some places, definitely. if it's financially viable. But mostly I'm keen to kind of keep the connection between my homelands, and because I feel like that's something I can feel I should be able to have, and that should be my priority. So trying to keep it mostly to Canada and New Zealand, especially when there's family to visit, kind of thing.
So, how's your mother? We haven't really talked about the other connection that we have.
Yeah.
Is through your mother, who was a famous writer and teacher. So how is that? You said she gives you advice. Did she read your manuscript and say, here's what I think? Or how did she go, oh, this is yours?
Very much she was hands off while I was writing it. It was actually her first year being like a tenured lecturer at the IAML. I came down to visit her and I said, I'm going to apply for the master's program. And then she said, I just got a job teaching the master's program.
Oh,
and
wow.
she was like, why? Why did you choose this year? So we had kind of independently returned to this place. Yeah, but I was not in her class, and we very much keep things separate on that level. As well, because we're very close, but also I'm very sensitive and she's very good at giving feedback. So it's like she's definitely, I mean, it's tricky because she's also one of the few people in her field doing the kind of stuff she's doing. And that field is, my field. And then also, I think she's very good at what she does. And if she wasn't my mum, I would very much be seeking her guidance. So I have to kind of get it informally, but that's okay because it still works out good. And she reads things kind of after they're done. She read the book after I finished that MA year and kind of stuff like that. But
yeah.
She's good. So.
Well, we should say your mother is Tina Makareti, and so if you were looking at other great literature to read, then definitely.
Yeah.
I actually was one of the master's supervisors because I was the writer in residence when Once Upon a Time in Aotearoa was coming together. So I read some of the original stories for that. So
wild.
That was a while ago. Okay, we have 2 minutes to go. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to talk about?
No, I think I feel like we've been all over the place. Like,
Are you having a book reading here?
Oh yes, I think I will be doing an event at Massey Books.
Oh, great.
On October 20th, quite possibly.
Okay.
Yes, which is very exciting because we love Massey Books. And I order books from them and then make my sister kind of ferry them back to New Zealand. But yeah, that is very exciting.
Yeah, and they just won the award for Best Bookstore in Vancouver and the Indigenous owned bookstore, so that's awesome.
Yeah, well deserved.
Yeah, so yes, we will be publicising that and trying to get everyone along. It would be great to see you in person. Yeah. It is 3 o'clock. I have a few final announcements. First of all, many thanks, Kōtuku, for getting up at chef hours to talk to us today. We would like to say that you can purchase the books also from 32 Books. You can order those. And we would like to thank all the staff and volunteers at Word Vancouver for making these events possible. We would love it if you checked out wordvancouver.ca next Saturday at UBC Robson Square. That is going to be the 10 till 5 o'clock hybrid session. And I crazily have agreed to be in the haiku challenge, which is at 2 o'clock, and we'll be volunteering there. And then the following Saturday, September the 23rd, is at the Surrey Public Library. That'll be from 10:30 to 4:30. But there are also other online events, and one is starting at 3:30, and there is another one on Wednesday. So please go to the festival website and check it all out. And have a lovely Monday, Kōtuku, and say hi to your mum from me.
Thank you, David.
Kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora. Thank you.